Now, it's hard for me to say a lot that's very informative about uh, how a utilitarian would go about calculating the pros and cons for assisting people in dire conditions. The reality is this is a question that is answered by economists, scientists, and a number of other people. It's a very, like I've been saying, a very complex problem. But at a general level, we can see what benefits might come about from helping other people who are suffering from poverty. One is that we could reduce their amount of pain, and that would be really good. And it would probably come at much minimal cost to ourselves. I mean, think about the things that we could give up. For instance, to help other people. I could, for instance, forego a new iPhone upgrade, or I could forego buying a new shirt, or I could forego getting a new pair of fancy shoes. Now, in each case, it is going to come at some cost to me to not get these things because I desired these things and I don't get to get them, and so there is a little bit of desire frustration there, you might say, or a little bit of pain from missing out. It's like, man, it would have been really nice to get that new pair of jeans or that new those new Jordans that came out. But then you think about my pain that I receive from not getting those things, and then compare the pain that you spare someone else in another part of the world. And you can't say either for the utilitarian that, well, they're not Americans. You know, sometimes people will say things like, well, we need to focus on Americans and America and get ourselves straight before we help others. But that's, again, not something the utilitarian is going to say. For them, morality doesn't know national boundary lines. And the reality is that people in other parts of the world, even though some people do starve in the United States, it's not nearly on the level that people experience pain and suffering from lack of resources in other parts of the world. And the truth is you could probably do way more good. $10 isn't going to go very far in the United States in terms of helping someone to alleviate their poverty, but $10 will go a long ways in a country where people earn only $1 a day. It'll go much further. You can buy maybe 2 meals in the United States for $10. You could feed a person for a week in some parts of the world. And so I'm mentioning this is because we can see that there would be some obvious benefits to helping people. We would alleviate their pain. Not only that, but chances are they would receive actually, not just that they would have their pain assuaged, but they would actually be happier as a result. They would receive more pleasure from the same amount of money. So, for instance, think about how much happiness can you get from $50? Well, I know some of you having dirty thoughts right now, but $50. Maybe I could afford a new iPhone upgrade, and that would bring me a little bit of happiness, probably like a 5 or 6. All right, but how much happiness can a person in sub-Saharan Africa get for $50? Well, that might feed them for an entire month. And so you see, it's not just about minimizing their pain, which we could certainly do, and comparing their pain versus ours, but also comparing their happiness for the same price of money. $50 will get me maybe 6 units of happiness, but it'll get somebody who's starving to death in a part of the world where my money will go a lot further, will get them way more happiness from that same amount of money. Kind of think of it like this in a way. Have you ever had like a really delicious steak or a piece of food, and it's really delicious, and the first bite you take, it's so succulent and juicy and so good, and then the second bite you take, it's pretty good too, and the third bite, but then somewhere along the way, you start to get full and you're satisfied, and the food is not giving you more and more pleasure. In fact, it might even become painful at a certain point where you're like, well, I got to finish this steak, I paid for it, all right? You think about like that first bite you get and how much pleasure that produces for you. At a certain point, you start to get less and less return on the steak you're eating. It's called hitting the point of diminishing returns. And it's the same thing for donating money or using money for charity to help people in these third world nations. The money, the set money that I have will bring me, to come a point where my happiness hits a level of diminishing returns. And so I could consider using that happiness, that money to buy myself more happiness, you might say, or I could send it overseas or send it to someone or give it to someone who's suffering from poverty, and it's going to produce way more happiness. what has become, like the 20th bite of steak for me, that same money will buy them what is the equivalent of that very first taste of steak, you might say. And so I'm saying these things just so you can see generally what a utilitarian would say when it comes to helping people who are suffering. One, we could minimize their pain. Number two, the money we would use to buy our own happiness, we could produce much, much more happiness by sending it somewhere else. Alternatively, we do have to consider the harms that could be done by sending money to other parts of the world. And the reality is that we may, in the long run, do more harm than good by giving aid to people. And in fact, just a year or so ago, Angus Deaton, he's a Nobel Prize-winning economist, he argued that all of America and Europe's efforts to help Africa has actually made Africa worse off. All of our efforts to try to send in supplies and send in food has actually made those countries where we send it worse off. And the reason he speculates is because he says basically what it does is it makes it so that the politicians in those countries are no longer accountable to their citizens. That it creates more and more corruption, and that it slows economic growth. And here's a chart that represents this, and what you can see right here is this line right here represents the aid that we have given to Africa over the last 40 or so years. And this right here represents the growth in African countries. And you can see there's a direct or an inverse correlation here between how much we give and how much they grow. The more we seem to give, the less that their country's economy seems to grow. And so this is a really important thing to consider. And some of you are probably aware of something like this happening on a smaller scale of people maybe, and this doesn't happen in all cases, and I don't mean to imply that, but sometimes people get on welfare, for instance, and they become dependent on the system, and they lose their motivation to work. Or, take another case of someone who lives at home with their parents until they're 40 and they refuse to work. And they do this because, they don't have to, because they're going to keep getting paid regardless. This is just one kind of potential bad consequence that can come about from giving repeated aid to someone. It basically can establish this relationship of dependency where the person who's receiving the aid is no longer encouraged to work hard. Or, like Angus Deaton identified, it can create, and when we're talking about countries, corruption within the countries. And so this is a really important thing to consider when we're thinking about our notion of helping people in these countries. On the one hand, it's really nice to think that by sending money, what we'll end up doing is reducing their amount of pain and suffering. It'll alleviate their poverty. But what if in the long run, it leads to more pain and suffering by trying to help them? What if in the long run, it actually leads to more overall poverty and more overall suffering? And this is something worth considering. Furthermore, we could argue that we shouldn't send aid because there might be better ways of helping people other than just funneling money into their countries. For instance, what if it produced more happiness not to send aid in the form of humanitarian relief, but to send industry to build, a factory in one of these countries, and so that they could create jobs and they could create a fully functioning society. This might be better than sending aid. And so we can see here that there are reasons that we have on utilitarian grounds for helping people. It would reduce their pain. They could receive more pleasure from the money we use for ourselves than we would. On the other hand, by sending them money, we actually might create this relationship of dependency. We might have corrupting effects on the government. And maybe there are better ways to go about achieving, bringing about happiness and ending poverty in these countries. And the truth is like I said, this is really complicated, and I don't know the answer to it. And I don't think anybody knows the answer to it. This is something that economists and various other scientists, they debate about, is should we be sending money to these countries? Does it do more harm or does it do more good? And I can't tell you what the utilitarian would say because the science is just not determined as of yet as to whether or not sending aid does more harm or does more good. But what I want to highlight here are some of the implications of the utilitarian view. And what's interesting about their view is, let's suppose for the sake of argument that it would produce more money to give, more happiness to give my money to the poor. Then the principle of utility, what it implies is that you're morally obligated to give your money to the poor. If, for instance, go back to my simple example, if giving that child on the street the $10 would produce more happiness, then the utilitarian says you're morally required to do that. And what that means is that you would be immoral not to give your money to that child. And the reason this is really interesting is because the principle of utility, it basically entails that this other person, this child on the street, whom you never met, you don't know, is entitled to your money. You're morally required to give your money to them. And this is a little different than you might have thought about things, because you might think, well, it's my money. I worked for it. I earned it. But that's not the way the utilitarian thinks about it. Again, this is very much like with criminal punishment. When you say it's my money, I worked for it, this is a backwards looking reason. You're looking to what you've done in the past, to what you deserve now. But for the utilitarian, it's always about looking to the future, looking at what benefits are going to come about from this particular action. And if giving your money to the child would create more happiness in the world, then in effect, that's that child's money. It goes to them. It's not about what you've done. It's not about what you deserve. It's about where the money is going to produce the most happiness. On the other hand, if it would produce more happiness to keep your money and not give it to the child or not send it to a charity, then you're morally required to do that. And what's interesting about this is most everybody thinks that you do nothing wrong if you give money to charity. But the principle of utility entails that sometimes you do something wrong if you give money to charity. Sometimes you're acting immorally if you give money to charity. Why? Because if your gift to charity, if your gift to that small child would actually lead to more unhappiness, more pain in the world, then you shouldn't do it. And this might sound really harsh in a way, but I think it actually makes some sense when you think about it. After all, what if you try to do something really nice for someone and it actually makes their condition way, way worse? How can that possibly have been the right action if it creates more pain and suffering in the world? And that's precisely what the utilitarian is saying. They're saying, if it's going to lead to more pain and suffering, you shouldn't do it. It would be wrong of you to do it. And it might make you feel good, to send money and help people, but if it's actually making their lives more miserable, then you shouldn't do it. And that's basically what the utilitarian's view of charity amounts to. So with all this being said, we can kind of summarize the theory of utilitarianism and summarize some of the main points of the last few lessons. And one thing we can say is that the principle of utility is supported by some common sense notions that we have. Going back to 2 lectures ago, number 1, it seems that this principle is motivated by this idea that consequences matter and that happiness is good and pain is bad. Furthermore, it seems like we do have this recognition that we should strive to help the most number of people possible. Think back to, for instance, the trolley car thought experiment that I had provided for you, or think about the example of destroying 1 home versus 5. It seems like the right action in those cases are going to be the actions that harm the fewest number of people and make the most number of people happy. Furthermore, we can say that the theory of utilitarianism, it actually does seem to square with our shared core moral beliefs. At least at first pass it seems to. We have this idea, or we've seen that it works itself out. We use utilitarian reasons in wartime decisions, and these things seem right. So it does seem to line up with many of our common moral beliefs. At the same time, it does ask us to think about the world in some different ways. We have to give up on this notion that criminals deserve punishment. Maybe that's not such a bad thing, though. Maybe the utilitarian's right is that this notion of deserving punishment, you're just basically is bloodthirsting, you're seeking revenge. Maybe we should give up on that. It does ask us to refine our ideas about what I deserve when it comes to my money. It asks us to refine our ideas about our treatment of animals. And it asks us to refine our ideas about who deserves moral consideration in general. We shouldn't be prejudiced against people because they're from a different race or a different nationality or a different religion or even a different species, according to the utilitarian.